Oh, hello there. I'm Jimmy Shuker alongside Albert Chalmers, and this is Radiant Light, a spiritual discussion podcast, episode 6, Confucianism. On today's episode of the show, Albert and I will be inviting our first ever guest, Shawn Goodman, to speak about Confucianism. Shawn is a philosophy major, a history teacher, and has lived in China. He'll be speaking about Confucianism, and although he doesn't necessarily agree with the philosophy, he's well placed to speak on the subject and offers a unique perspective. With that being said, let's take a look at the story of Confucius. Confucius himself was an ancient Chinese philosopher and also a student of Lao Tzu. Thought to have lived round about the year 550 BC, legend has it that Confucius was once an advisor to the ruler of his home state, Lu. When the ruler received a gift of dancing girls, he neglected his duties to focus on the girls. Confucius walked out in disgust and spent the following years roaming China, looking for a new ruler to work for and reflecting on life. During this time, he became a famous philosopher and gained many followers. His followers wrote a book of his many sayings, known as the Analects. We will now discuss the philosophy of Confucius in great detail. And with that being said, let's take you to the interview. Hello, welcome to Radiant Light.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on.
Yes, it's a privilege. How are you doing? Everything good?
Good. Nice to see you.
Yes, great to see all of you. Firstly, Shawn, happy Chinese New Year.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, 新年快乐 to you too.
Oh, thank you. Wow. Even got the Mandarin version, right?
Yeah.
How was it? How was it today? I heard you was out celebrating.
I was visiting a friend, and right now she's staying around Niagara Falls for a couple months. And I met her in China originally in Tianjin, and so I was there with her and her partner, and we stayed, ate some dumplings, and had some kind of traditional dishes. A couple cocktails. Yeah, it was.
Wow, sounds sounds really fun actually. Wish we were there, eh, Albert?
Yeah, it'd be cool. Did you say she was like a think?
Yeah, that's how I met her. Was at the time, her now ex-husband, he was Canadian, and so I kind of met him through some other co-workers of mine. And yeah, the two of them opened up a bar together. So it was actually for quite a while. It was a pretty popular spot in Tianjin, which is it's a city 30 minutes away from Beijing on the train. And yeah, for a while it was a pretty popular spot with foreigners in the city. And sadly it closed down eventually. But
what a shame.
It felt kind of, the setting is one of those places you walk in, everyone knows your name. So I made a lot of good friends there actually. So it was good times.
Awesome. So on today's episode of the show, we're going to be having a chat about Confucius and Confucianism. I thought a really good starting point would be the Analects. So I understand that's a book that Confucius is most famous for. But something Albert and I were a little bit unclear on when we were preparing for the show was I was under the interpretation that this was one book of philosophy written by Confucius's followers. But Albert was telling me that perhaps the Analects was part of a series of books. I'm not sure if you can kind of clear.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert on the Analects. What I've read, there does seem to be some debate as to the authorship of it. From what I've heard, the most widely accepted theory is that it was collected by his followers after his death, and it was allegedly a collection of his sayings.
It's kind of like how Plato recorded Socrates' sayings, right? Something like that.
Yeah, I think that would be quite a good comparison. So yeah, there's a lot that we know about, but of course it's always coming through the lens of Plato. So I think that there's a lot of similarities that we could see with Confucius as well, because he wasn't compiled by him during his lifetime. So all the information we're getting about Confucius is sort of secondary sources written after the fact. So it can
and
complicate things.
Retrospective, I'd imagine, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you got a copy of the Analects. You have that, Albert was telling me.
Yes, I do actually. I do have a copy of it. I haven't finished the whole thing. It can be a little bit difficult to get through at times.
Okay.
I picked it up in China, and it's quite an old translation. It was written in the 19th century. So I feel like some of the language and maybe my version isn't quite the most up to date.
Okay.
Yeah, although perhaps maybe a little bit to the author of my translation, because when I was doing some more research into Confucius, it was unbeknownst to me, this 19th century translator whose book I have actually played a pretty important role in helping to disseminate ideas of Confucianism throughout the West. So maybe that could be a topic we could get into.
What's the guy's name?
James Legge, Legge, Legge.
Okay. And you grabbed that while you were in China, you said?
Yep, that's correct.
Just out of curiosity, or was it like required reading? Or one time in China it was like mandatory in all schools to memorize most of the Analects and recite them at school, and until the communist regime, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, I guess we can start sort of at the end of the story of Confucianism and work backwards from there. If
Sure.
But yeah,
far away, yeah.
Yeah, but no, what you're saying is entirely accurate. That so you're probably familiar with the imperial examination system. So Confucianism and Confucianist texts played a pretty essential role in Chinese government in the imperial dynasties for centuries, millennia. But then during the earlier communist, did really try to de-emphasize traditional texts. They saw them as being more backwards or obsolete, or sort of propagating superstition or propagating ideas that didn't really fit very well with their modern conception of communism.
Is that like the Great Leap Forward, that kind of modern thing? Is that where that term comes from? I'm sorry if I'm incorrect there.
So more on the cultural front, it'd be the Cultural Revolution. I mean, Confucianism did start to fall out of favor quite a few decades before that. Even in the very late Qing, in the early Republican era, it was already in a period of decline. But then during the Cultural Revolution, it was really openly attacked. So during that time, it would have been dangerous for a professor to openly, teach Confucianism or openly advocate for Confucianism. Just much like with Buddhism and Taoism, Confucianist temples were also for vandalism by the Red Guard. So that would have been a particularly dark time for anybody that was like an adherent to Confucianism. But since then, there has been quite a modern revival, especially as China's government, their sort of ethos, their ideology has really shifted. It's kind of a complicated discussion in itself, but as China's moved away from more traditionalist Marxism and Maoism, as that has been really kind of pushed to the sidelines in terms of the ideological in modern years. Well, I would probably 80s or 90s, there's been quite a resurgence in studying Confucian texts in schools, So yeah, there has been quite a revival really in the past 30, 40 odd years.
So my understanding was that a lot of emphasis on the importance of rituals and ceremony. For example, birthday anniversaries. Was this kind of thing like kind of stamped out at a time, are you saying? Or
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so in the earlier communist period and under Mao, getting any sort of traditional philosophy or traditional religions. Yeah, certainly things like ancestor worshipped, shrines, these sort of rituals, they would have been seen as, kind of outdated, superstitious, backwards even. So
wow.
so during the Cultural Revolution, yeah, all of these, Confucianism was just one of many sort of philosophy practices or religious, practices that were targeted.
How did that go over, would you say, if you had to speculate? Was that part of the public? Because it sounds like it's a very inherently Chinese thing to have this ancestor worship and these cultural ceremonies, like even New Year's, right? Like, was there a backlash when they tried to stamp it out?
That is a really good question and a very difficult one to answer because the documentation during this period was destroyed. Also, people were very afraid to speak up. It was a time of great chaos in China. I guess essentially to provide a little bit of context here. So this is taking place in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s. At this time, by the 1960s, Mao's power was starting to decline. A lot of people in the government were starting to see him as, okay, maybe he's going to be more of this central committee is kind of, we're the ones that are going to be in control of the government. To this power struggle, Mao accused them of being reactionaries and secret capitalists and not true Marxists. And he had this idea that young people would have to revitalize the revolution. So he had seen this whole kind of generation, the late 1940s, right? So this is a few decades later. He sees China as becoming more complacent, more towards a capitalist sort of mindset. So it was part internal power struggles within China, and then partially it was Mao, he was certainly a believer in Marxist theory, right? So part of it too was Mao trying to really advance this sort of Marxist, revolution. He said that the country should, revolution. I'm kind of paraphrasing there, but so that's the sort of backdrop of what was happening, and it was quite a tumultuous time. There was what they called struggle sessions. I'm not sure if either of you have heard of them before.
I have not. No, I have not.
Tell us more, please. Yeah.
So they would take individuals, oftentimes educated people, professors, teachers, educators, scientists, and they would be attacked for their beliefs. They'd be accused of being secret capitalists.
Is this like the Khmer Rouge incidents in Cambodia?
It never reached that level. It never reached the level of Cambodia. I mean, it's hard to say how many people died. It was definitely in the tens of thousands. It could have been hundreds of thousands. Some people even say into the millions. The numbers vary widely. But let's say a lowball estimate, there might have been low hundred, maybe 100,000 people that died. Again, it's hard to say. There's a lot of conflicting evidence, but it did create this climate of fear where people were afraid to speak up. Again, some people lost their lives. Other people were, lost their jobs. They took academics and they sent them to the countryside. They would take Buddhist monks, priests, and they would oftentimes, tie them up, and everyone in the public would come and, criticize them and shout at them and spit on them and accuse. Yeah. So that was part of the struggle session. So it was the idea that these sessions where you're tied up and everyone in your community, town, university, village, whatever, everyone comes and screams their grievances and sometimes physically assaults you, it was thought that this would be like a purifying ritual that would purify both the community and sort of get rid of these sort of like capitalist intentions of the individual in question.
Wait, they were accusing the Buddhist monks of being capitalists? That is confusing.
Maybe not necessarily capitalists, but you know, they were reactionary, that they were putting forward a traditional philosophy that was going to hold back China, that it was going to hold back its
Right.
development. So maybe not necessarily capitalist, but they would have seen them as kind of conservative. So yeah, generally speaking, due to the chaos of this period, going back to your initial question, Albert, it is quite hard to say how many people actually agreed with it, because if you openly disagreed, it was quite literally dangerous. So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
pretty hard to tell what percentage of the population would have agreed with these kind of policies. However, getting back to your point, say that it wasn't widely successful, because in the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution and afterwards, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, China kind of starts to swing back in the opposite direction. During this time, philosophies were exonerated and started to have a resurgence, and people continued to participate in going to shrines and participating in ancestral worship practices. So I mean, I would say in the long term it did impact Chinese society, but it certainly did any of these traditional values in the long term.
I just want to mention, like, if you take it all the way back to the first unified Chinese empire, is it the Qin Empire? Same thing. Is it not the same? They tried to destroy all the texts of Confucius and Lao Tzu and all of them, right? So it's not the first time they tried that.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, for the majority of Chinese history, has been the dominant philosophy, or religion. I mean, that's another discussion that we can have, whether it's a
Right.
religion or a philosophy. I would say it's more of a philosophy, but again, it's not as straightforward. It's not that straightforward. But yeah, the Qin, they did try to eliminate Confucian scholars. Yeah, later in like the Tang, like the Sui and the Tang, there was a resurgence in Confucianism, but then it had more of a falling out dynasty around the Song, but then it makes a comeback. So it's sort of always like coming into the forefront, only to be challenged or to perhaps kind of fade away at certain periods, but sort of ebb and flow to the sort of mainstream influence there.
So before we move on, is this ebb and flow kind of like there's these three, the Taoism, the Confucianism, and the Buddhism, and they kind of like take turns being in prominence, or is it usually that Confucianism is the most popular, or?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think Confucianism is the leading philosophy?
That's a good question. I would say because the characteristicism make it especially adaptable to a ruling philosophy. Taoism, I don't know if it's a philosophy that would fit really well if you're trying to run an empire and maintain control. Taoism is probably not going to be very efficient at that. Whereas Confucianism, again, a lot of the values that Confucius sort of advocated for are ones that fit pretty well into sort of a ruling, philosophical structure.
Is it the hierarchies that allow for the patriarchy kind of thing that is in Confucianism? The father of the family is the head of the family, and those kind of values.
So that's a big component of Confucianism, right? Is that there's these sort of relationships which are hierarchical, but they're intended to be reciprocal. So that's one of the relationships. And so it doesn't mean that the ruler, it can do whatever they desire. They still have responsibilities to their subjects, and the subjects in turn have a responsibility to serve that ruler, king, or so on. So it's not as following hierarchies, but the idea of hierarchies is quite ingrained between ruler and subject, husband and wife, father and son, elder brother and younger brother, older friend to younger friend. I might be missing one there. But yeah, so I would again, there's probably different arguments that could be made here. I would say that is probably the biggest reason, though, why I perceive that it was so successful, why it was so, most dynasties from the Han onwards.
I mean, it does seem like a philosophy that supports the regime and somebody ruling. It's really surprising that an empire would want to snuff the philosophy out.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. I mean, I think part of that too is just, again, generally speaking, Confucianism coexists with other, with Taoism, with Buddhism. But I think at various points throughout the history of the Chinese dynasties, usually Buddhism. I can't really think of a case where Taoism was intended to, supplant Confucianism, but certainly there was times where Buddhism, you'd get a ruler who was a devout Buddhist, and they would try to prioritize Buddhist teachings in their court over Confucianist ones.
Yeah, I can imagine. Do you think China? I mean, how do you think China would have looked if Taoism would have become the leading philosophy?
Yeah, I think that's a really cool question. It's so hard to imagine. I think it would be a lot more decentralized. I think that would be a possibility. It would be more decentralized. It probably would be a lot more communal in terms of different individual communities doing their own kind of self-government, as opposed, sort of top-down overarching structure. But I'm not quite sure.
Agrarian as well, perhaps.
Quite possibly. Mm-hmm.
And why do you enjoy Chinese philosophy yourself?
That's a good question. I mean, I think I like studying all philosophies. I think that it's interesting to get different viewpoints, different perspectives.
Can you give your bit of your background just real quick, like actually a philosophy major and all that on the last episode, but it would be cool to just hear it from your
minor. My major is in history. I could see where you might get confused though, because I did switch my majors multiple times. I had trouble deciding, so I went history, then philosophy, and then I was in anthropology, and then I went back to history, and then I sort of did like a kind of a full circle there. So I studied quite a bit of philosophy in my undergrad. Later in my master's, I did a history MA, and I did my bachelor's, and then I moved to China, and then when master's, and I really had this newfound appreciation for Chinese history, for Chinese culture. So when I was in my master's, I did focus a lot on Chinese history. I worked with a historian, just wonderful man. He writes predominantly on the Republican era, so like the early 20th century. He does a lot on the region of Manchuria. He does a lot on the history of as well. So I worked with him when I was in my master's and took some courses with him. And
what was the other course? Sexuality?
Yes, that was one of the courses that I took with him, was gender and sexuality in modern Chinese history.
That sounds really interesting. Can you maybe like just nutshell that one? Possible to like sum up in a Just because I wonder if Confucianism did play any role in that, knowing that men were seen as the head of the household and these kind of Old Testament type viewpoints, that did they carry over into the 20th century?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely Confucianism has had or continues to have, well, in a variety of ways in China. But yes, in particular, it did help to reinforce patriarchal values. Again, as we were talking about, Confucianism is very much based upon husband and wife being one of them. And Confucius really did place the family at the center of his philosophy. Thought that basically all good was going to family. If you have a disorderly family, well, you're going to have a disorderly society. But if everyone has an orderly family, if the family is living in harmony, if hierarchies are being respected, if obligations are being fulfilled, you're going to have a harmonious family, and then in turn you'll have. So a lot of these sort of these again, oftentimes patriarchal ideas or ideas pertaining to masculinity were certainly influenced by this, by the father being the central role, playing a central role in the family, kind of the father being the head of the family, as and continues to influence Chinese conceptions of gender and masculinity even into.
Hmm.
Wow.
Did you guys notice that when you were in China? I know, Jimmy, you've been there too, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a patch on what you've done, though, Shawn. I mean, I visited China for 10 days. Bit of a, obviously, it was fantastic, fascinating trip, but it was, the main touristy highlights. How long did you say you was in China for?
Years, non-consecutively. So I lived there for 1 year, and then I
Mm.
went back for 3.5. Yeah, we're in China.
I started in Beijing, moved on to Xi'an, the ancient capital city. Went to a place called Zhangjiajie. Really beautiful nature. It's
Oh, yeah.
Is that where they filmed
Avatar.
Avatar?
Yeah.
where they
Right.
filmed. Oh, yeah, it was
You went to
incredible.
Pandora.
Yeah, honestly, it's the most beautiful place I've seen on earth. Like really fantastic. And yeah, then of course we finished up in Shanghai. So we crammed quite a lot into a trip. It was pretty intensive. So much to see, but yeah, it was beautiful. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's a beautiful country, and it's a place too where you don't realize how big it is until you get there. And even though there's
Mm.
this wonderful network of trains that make it really easy to travel. In fact, even today when I was driving back home and I got hell thick and there's a snowstorm, I was kind of like wishing, I'm like, I wish I was in China right now. I would just be on that bullet train, 300 kilometers an hour already. Like, I'm like, I hate like how we've built our cars, like so frustrating. So in China has this wonderful network of trains that are quite cheap, quite affordable, that go really fast. Oftentimes they'll go 3 kilometers an hour.
Wow.
But in spite of that, it's still just a massive country, and there's but those are definitely some great places that you chose, though, especially Zhangjiajie. That's one that not a lot of. It's not, again, Beijing, Shanghai, but like that's a bit off the beaten track for sure.
Yeah, I
Definitely rural.
researched a little bit deeper for that one, and once I found out about, we had to get it into the trip. But just going back to what you said about the travel, that was I was amazed by it. We were traveling through cities that were in the process of being built, a whole inhabited, and you're like, wow, the infrastructure that's going to be going into this, it really blew my mind.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it is. And I would visit a city and then I would go back, I would just, a construction site, big hole, go back 2 years later and there would be like 15 or 20 new skyscrapers. The rate of development is just mind blowing, especially I'm not quite, your kind of hometown Jimmy, but where Albert and I, these projects, like they're fixing the highway and it takes them 10 years to fix a small stretch. You see them working on an apartment building for years, but yeah, it's just over there. It's like, and it looks like a totally different city.
Yeah, I can imagine. And to spend a longer, more consistent chunk in China, you get the opportunity to see all of that happen, whereas I'm just getting that perspective of Bloom, blink of an eye. Oh, wow, what's this town, this city that's going up,
Yeah, for sure.
Just wanted to come back. You, at the start of the conversation, that you'd like to come back to the author of your copy of the Analects. Was there something you wanted to say about that before we move on?
Yeah, absolutely. Or I'd like to go over that. I would like to go over some more So I know starting some of the more, we've kind of started with the negative, but I would like to go to the positive. I wasn't sure which we should do that in. Because overall with Confucianism, I would say I have a complex sort of relationship of it, because there's certainly a lot of ways that it's been utilized with. But fundamentally, a lot of the values that Confucius talked about, I think, were quite profound and important. I don't want us to only focus on the negative aspects, because there's some positive there as well. But yeah, so to explain the author, we need to go, I think, a little bit whether or not Confucianism is a religion or a philosophy.
Okay.
Because that's one of the kind of the central interesting points about this author and what he was trying to do with these translations.
Under the assumption that Confucianism was a philosophy, and until you mentioned a religion, I'd really possibility.
Yeah. So I think generally speaking, people perceive it to be and generally surveys that go out in China, not many people really identify themselves religiously. As well, China has a list of official religions, and that are sort of kind of permitted, and that are recognized by the government as being traditional new religions in China that are practiced. But Confucianism is not on that list, so the Chinese government itself doesn't recognize as a religion.
What's on the list, if you could name like a couple of them?
Buddhism, I believe Taoism, Islam, Christianity, and I think there's one more that I might be forgetting.
Okay.
Yeah. So it does make Confucianism complicated in this sense, is that there's no clergy, there's no organized religious structure to it. Itself never claimed to be any kind of prophet, but there are a lot of religious aspects that go hand in hand with Confucianism. So we've talked about sort of hierarchies already. And another very, very important aspect of Confucianism that we briefly mentioned is rituals, sacrifice, and basically giving kind of homage to your ancestors, to the spiritual world. Confucian in the Analects, he advocated for this. He advocated that people needed to follow the traditions of their ancestors. They needed to pray. They needed to go to shrines. When they had a parent that died, they needed to give proper offerings. They needed to do a set sort of mourning period to kind of show to their parents. So sage, at the same time, he really did advocate for these religious practices. And you do see that today in Confucian temples. People will go there and they will sometimes say prayers. They will sometimes burn incense. It's the Confucian temples. They're not as widespread as Buddhist temples, but it has become somewhat of a tradition for before exam week, before the Gaokao, which is like the big like the SATs of China. And before the Gaokao, students will go and like light an incense and burn it and say a prayer. So there is like a kind of religious rituals to the philosophy, which makes it complicated, especially for Westerners to be able to comprehend.
Lines a little bit.
Yeah. So getting into James Legge, he's writing in the 19th century, but a few centuries prior to that, when the Jesuits came to China, they encountered Confucianism and they didn't really know what to make of it, right? Because for all the reasons that we've just said, it's again, it's more of a philosophy, but it does have a lot of kind of religious elements at least tied to it. And so when the Jesuits came and they were trying to comprehend the religion, which was a typical strategy, they would come, they would observe, they would see of a people, and they would go, okay, well, we're going to use some of their traditions, try to market Christianity to them, Catholicism to them. So they would say, okay, well, this is your traditional God that you worship. Oh, that kind of fits in with Christianity. This is just like, it's sort of like a saint. You're not worshiping a God. There's one God, but you're worshiping a saint. So you don't have to get rid of your traditions. You just need to incorporate them into Catholicism, which is a pretty effective strategy. So when they first arrived, they tried this with Confucianism. They had a lot of difficulty comprehending it. And there was even some controversy, like there was a big debate as to whether or not they believed Confucianism religion, or if it should be like certain things like ancestor worship, if it should be permitted if somebody was a Catholic Confucian. So it led to all of these sort of controversies and debates after contact with the West. And that's where the author of this, not the author, the translator of the book comes in. Gay. And he was actually a missionary who had come, I believe he was Scottish. He was a Scottish missionary who had come to China. He studied Chinese. He became fluent. He studied the culture, the religion, the language, the philosophy. He studied, became for what at the time would have been quite the expert. There were not many people that were doing this, in the 19th century. And so that was one of the reasons his translation. I mean, well, he was a scholar, so there was certainly some academic interest as well. But part of the reason was that he was trying to show that Confucianism was, in fact, with Christianity. And so that was one of his reasons for writing this book and doing the translation. Debates as to whether or not Confucianism is a religion go back pretty far in the West. I think that generally speaking, it's not. I think that I don't know if Chinese people contemplate it as much. I think for them, they understand religions can coexist together. When I was there, it would not be uncommon to see somebody, go to a Buddhist temple one weekend and say a prayer, but then another time, maybe they'd be back in their hometown. They might go to some sort of Taoist shrine. So for someone in China, there's not always this like line, whereas here it's like, oh, I'm a Catholic, I'm not a Protestant, or I'm a Methodist. We kind of create these like binaries like that. Whereas in China, it's very common for people to just sort of exist together. It's not to say that they always coexist peacefully over there. I don't want to make it seem like it's necessarily utopian, but I think that the idea of these binaries is not as deeply ingrained. China, they might not necessarily see Confucianism as a religion in the same sense, but again, they might still go and they might very well tell their son to light some incense at a Confucianist temple before his exam.
Sounds beautiful. Okay, so you wanted to say something positive about Confucius. I guess here's your shot, so to speak. What are some of the most positive aspects that you feel
has brought to China? That's your personal favorites, say?
Mhm. I think the most positive aspect has probably been in education. I mean, education is pillars of Confucianism. You know, Confucius believed that some like a key, or it could be like a guide to help improve society. Education into, you know, education of rituals, and also just self-betterment, you know, the pursuit of trying to better oneself was the way that society would improve on both an individual level and on a larger society. So I think that that's pretty positive. And you do see that as well in China to this day. You know, I've system, I've, you know, worked with students all different ages, and I would say there's quite a deep respect for teachers in China. It's so it's, here in the West, I mean, I wouldn't say teachers aren't respected. A little bit more ambivalence in our sort of popular culture, and teachers get the respect that they deserve. Whereas in China, a lot of these teaching jobs, you know, you're not, you know, they're not paying the same as a doctor. You're probably not going to get rich doing it, but in terms of the social standing, it's seen as a very respectable career, a way to show respect for teachers. Parents will really, even if they don't, they will spend what little they have on extra classes, you know, extra English classes, extra art classes. And so I would see that as probably being the most positive influence of society.
I think I kind of noticed that growing up too, just based on parents of Chinese friends of mine and stuff. There was definitely a emphasis on homework and being quiet in classrooms. Do you miss that level of respect you got when you were over there, or now that you're back in the West, so to speak?
Sometimes.
I guess they're a lot more easy to contain.
Yeah,
in that sense.
I would say classroom management was easier. It's a really complicated question though, because there's also again, like I said, there's a lot of respect for teachers and the profession, but the education system as a whole has a lot of issues in China. So oftentimes it did get frustrating. You know, certain, especially right now, like a bit of background, I'm doing my Bachelor of Education. So this will be my third degree. I'm studying education in a Canadian university, and just the sort of the philosophy of education versus the West is very different. In China, it's a lot more memorization, much more test based, which again likely has roots in Confucianism as well, because that became, I mean, after the death of Confucius, later in the Han Dynasty, they started to implement imperial examination system. It really, I think around I think a bit later on, like in the Tong, it started to really pick up. I know it was a very, very important of the Ming and the Qing dynasties, which at the time I would say was kind of progressive in a way. It was this idea that they would build a society that was a meritocracy, instead of just, oh well, this duke's uncle, you know, this duke's nephew is going to get the job because of nepotism. Well, now everyone equal playing field. You know, in theory, be a commoner and you could write the exam, and if you passed and did well enough, you could get an imperial appointment. Again, in practice, that usually didn't happen, but at the same time, it was this sort of, it did.
Okay.
So I think at the time that was, I think, pretty interesting. It's pretty unique to China. I guess Korea, somewhat Japan had somewhat similar sort of systems in place. So like I said, at the time, probably a good idea, but in today's sort of modern, you know, environment where, you know, being able to work collaboratively, being able to sort of brainstorm novel solutions to problems that are facing us, I feel like that is not emphasized as much as it should be in China. and they do really, really emphasize still the Gaokao, which is like the university entrance exam, and it is incredibly important. Like the country basically shuts down. So which again I find to be as there's a lot of students out there in Canada and the world who might not, they might choke up, they might be anxious, they might not be good at memorizing a lot of information, but I don't think that somebody's intelligence or success should necessarily just strictly be based on that, right? There's a lot of other ways that we can measure in a classroom.
It's like a form of institutional favoritism in a sense.
Yeah, for sure.
For better or worse.
To your question, that was a very, very long-winded way of saying yes, I miss a lot of the students, but I don't necessarily miss working within Chinese education system as a whole.
Fair enough.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a cool answer, actually. It gives you a little bit of someone like who has no insight whatsoever, like myself.
Yeah, it's different over there, that's for sure.
I think you mentioned that sorry, Jimmy.
Going to say this, the whole conversation's been fascinating. Just you can across the board, like for example, how you spoke about, visiting a Confucianist and then a Buddhist the other. That's I don't know. I think you struggle to get their head around that a little bit. I can't generalize for everybody, of course, but it's a very different way of looking at things. That's for sure.
Probably for the creation of Zen, I guess, the collaboration of those three disparate philosophies uniting into like one school of Buddhism, which is kind of why we're first place, to get back to it. But I remember talking to Shawn possibly like almost a year ago. You mentioned that you had read the Tao Te Ching and that you'd favored Taoism over Confucianism, and it sort of like set me off on this. So I guess you're part of the reason this podcast even exists in the first place, to be honest.
Well, thanks, man. I'm honored to hear that.
Well, look, we want to be respectful of your time, so we're but there was one other thing that we absolutely must talk about, if you could. It's a little bit off topic, but Albert was telling me that you spent some time in Shaolin Temple. Would
yes.
you like to speak to that a little bit? I could imagine you could talk for ages. Tell us a little bit about Shaolin Temple, please, Shawn.
Yeah, absolutely. I went once, I think it was about 2013 or 14, and then I went in 2019 with my sister. And it's a pretty interesting area. Like it's deep in the heart of China. Like it's in Henan province. It's in a pretty rural place, which itself makes it a pretty interesting place to go. It certainly does not have the same kind of polish as a tour Beijing or Shanghai. It's not. It's definitely. It's a very underdeveloped region, but it's developing rapidly. So it's a pretty interesting location. I don't know. It wasn't quite what I was expecting. I think it's just having watched a lot of martial arts films and loving things like kung fu and having a lot of respect for martial arts. Initially, my expectations were pretty high. I would say it has become consumerist, a little bit commercial in a sense. Like there's a really big gift shop, there's lots of tourists, lots of people taking photos. So when I was at the actual temple, it's I don't know if I want to say put off, but perhaps just a little bit disappointed because of this. And then I was telling this story to Albert today, that I was walking around disappointed, but still pretty cool. And then I decided, okay, there's this mountain. It's called Songshan, and it's right beside the Shaolin. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to go up there. I'm going to go for a walk up. And I went to the top of the mountain, and it was this beautiful winding like mountain path. I get over, I'm looking kind of over the edge, and I see like this orange near the cliff. And I'm like, well, what's that? And I look over, and it's actually a monk. Totally like empty. There's no tourists, this is not, because they're kind of like posing with tourists and stuff. And it was just up there by himself. He was just like, and he was just, it looked like he was doing Tai Chi. Like it was, it didn't look like Kung Fu. It looked more like Tai Chi, like, kind of like very slow, like flowing movements, and, kind of like doing these deep lunges side to side. And it was like right next to a cliff. He looked incredibly focused. Like it looked like everything else had just disappeared around him. Like he was just totally in some sort of meditative or flow state. And it was just me, and there was nobody else in some sort of Tai Chi or Wuxi exercises. And in that moment, I really felt the kind of the power of Shaolin. I was like, okay, this is what I came here to see. Like I didn't come here to see a gift shop, to see like, buy a plastic sword, but like this, okay, well, this is kind of beautiful, I guess. And it made me reflect, like, okay, well, traditionally the Shaolin Temple, now it's become this cultural icon, right? But traditionally it hasn't been, some sort of rich, institution, right? It's a pretty modest place. And so I was just contemplating, reflecting that, okay, well, maybe that's sort of what they have to do to survive in this modern world. Kind of sell these t-shirts, sell some, plastic Chinese straight sword. Maybe they have to do that to survive. But in that moment, I could see that, okay, there are some people here that are, maybe that you're not going to see this as an average tourist, but I could tell there's some people here that are very deeply committed to what they're doing. There's some people here that are clearly, very spiritual, very deeply involved in Buddhist arts. And that I felt very fortunate to actually get to see this monk just not performing for the tourists, not putting on a show. Just it felt like he was in his natural environment, and I felt like it was a beautiful moment.
Wow. Sounds like you discovered a real devotion.
Dig a little deeper, you can find the true Zen or the Shan Buddhists practicing their sacred forms and their meditations and things. It's just not everyone, you kind of extra privileged or blessed to have seen that. I think I'm blessed just to hear you talk about it, to be honest.
I think
me too.
I think too, you actually, like, you can go and study there. You would probably have an amazing experience. I know and his cousin studied there.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't know him very well. Like I've sort of, he's a relative of a friend, but I had a pretty profound experience there. And I've read some kind of blogs online, and I forget the guy's name. I found a YouTuber who studied daily routine in life. And so I do think that if you go and you study there and you're committed to it, you're going to meet some really incredible people that would help you along your journey of martial arts and Zen. And it's definitely a very powerful place. But my kind of precaution here would just be to say, yeah, if you're going as a tourist, you might not see that side, because they do kind of put up this commercial front now and we could argue, is that for better? Is that for worse? Like, I'm not sure. I'm not going to place a value judgment, but it's just something to consider if you're going in there.
Perhaps you got to just dig a little deeper and get off the beaten path yourself, take it into your own hands.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we're actually planning to have a future episode solely about Shaolin Temple, and today has been fantastic, really, really insightful. So if you'd like to come back on the show for a future episode about Shaolin Temple, very welcome to come and speak to that a little bit more, if you'd like.
Yeah, for sure. I would love to. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, no, I would love to be on the show again. I don't, my knowledge of the actual philosophical texts and the practices is doesn't compare to the knowledge that the two of you have.
Yeah, we're all
Yeah.
noobs here. We're just learning as we go. It's kind of that of Zen is what attracted to us to it in the first place. So, I mean, expert is not the word I would put on myself personally, but we're like fascinated enough to keep reading and researching. And personally, I'm practicing the martial arts. So even though in this modern like MMA environment that we live in, Kung Fu and Tai Chi is kind of like looked down upon a little bit. I do know what you're talking about, real element of it, and that's why I don't totally what do you call it, discredit it. Like I would like to do both personally. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I've been listening to all your previous episodes, and it is appreciated the conversations and to get more into. I mean, I lived in China and I've been to lots of Buddhist temples, and I'm a history teacher, history guy, so I like to kind of look at the big picture, how have religions impacted society. That's always been a curiosity of mine, but it's not something that I really practice. But I have been reflecting. I believe it was he first asked me to come on the podcast. I had mentioned that I would like to start practicing Zen and start practicing, Taoism, practicing these ideas more for the sort of psychological you could have. Oftentimes, we get caught up with work, frustrated, really fixated on problems, on negativity, and I think that having studying Taoism, studying Zen would really help to provide some kind of tangible psychological benefits, especially when someone's experiencing these stressful situations. Or for the listeners, we started this podcast a little bit late because I hit a snowstorm coming back, and I was getting pretty frustrated. The weather had changed. I didn't know it was going to start snowing so early. I was getting really frustrated because an hour and 40-minute drive turned into a 3-hour drive. So I was not very happy. I'm like, I'm going to be late. I'm going to let down my friend. And I start speeding up a little bit and try to remind myself, okay, well, you're going to be on a Zen podcast. Maybe you need to practice some Zen a little bit in this moment. Get too worked up, not let your emotions get the better of you, not try to speed and then have something terrible happen.
We
And
didn't
so
want that to happen.
Yeah. So no,
Absolutely
there's
not.
there's a lot of value in it, and it's something that I would like to practice more in my own life. So I appreciate that the two of you inspiring me to explore these ideas and topics again.
Cool. Likewise.
Thank you. Yeah, same to you. Yeah.
Okay, that appears to be all we have time for on today's episode. Don't forget to like this episode and follow us on YouTube, as well as whichever platform you listen to your podcasts on. And you can even follow us on Instagram too. So until next time, good night, God bless, namaste.